Yo guys, what is up? Max for Diablo 4 video, and today we're going over what I believe to be the absolute best version of Whirlwind. Now, we set out on stream to test every single type of Whirlwind because Whirlwind in of itself is a skill that you can make a build around, and there's a lot of different weapons that you can use with Whirlwind. And there's the two-handed sword variant, there's one-handed dueling sword variant, there is using a bludgeoning weapon, you can use a two-handed axe. There's so many different ways to play Whirlwind, and all of them come with pros and cons. And so what I wanted to do was set out and test dungeon times using this same dungeon layout with the different weapons and the different setups and time, and which one was going to be best, and like feel out and push higher dungeons. And what came out to be the absolute best from my testing is a really weird combo where we're actually using the Ramalani's Magnum Opus, right? This is going to give us a ton of damage. We'll talk about it in a second. And a one-handed bludgeoning mace. And this was an idea from a viewer, so I can't take full credit for it. But we took this idea and were able to push Whirlwind higher than I've ever pushed it before. And I want to explain everything that's going on here for you guys today and break down why this version of Whirlwind is really, really good. We're like breezing through Nightmare 70s right now. I actually haven't tried anywhere higher than Nightmare 70. I've got 2 aspect codexes on, aka like the lowest roll of aspects, where we could push this build so much higher. We're averaging like 1 mil crits, and I'm gonna be done hyping it up. But let's get into everything you guys need to know about this version of Whirlwind. So let's talk about the elephant in the room, and that is why you're using a one-handed mace. A sword, if I was using it, would come with crit damage, and crit damage is so much better than overpower damage. Maces come with overpower damage. How could a mace lead to more damage than a sword? And the answer is in our skill tree. Now, when we are using a one-handed mace on Whirlwind, our whole Whirlwind is converted to a bludgeon Whirlwind. Our skill is using a bludgeoning weapon, and we're able to get a massive damage increase. Wallop we're grabbing is a 30% multiplicative damage increase for the damage of our Whirlwind. And part of the reason that Bludgeon Whirlwind is able to do such high damage numbers is because it takes advantage of Wallop. However, because we're also using a slashing weapon, we get to take advantage of the best parts of the Bleed Whirlwind build, and that is that we get to use Furious Whirlwind, which we get to use 40% of our base damage converted to bleed, which stacks up our bleed damage. We're easily hitting 400,000 bleed damage per second on this build, and we get all of the quality of life and single target ramp up that bleeds gets. So we're getting the best of both worlds. We get the bleed quality of life and damage ramp up with the high numbers of a Bludgeon Whirlwind, and we get to use 3 weapon expertises. We get to use one-handed swords, and the axe, and that is why I think this is the absolute best version of Whirlwind. Now let's get into my gear. The first thing for gear we need to talk about is this sword. It is a brand new addition to our Whirlwind build, and it reads, skills using this weapon deal 0.3% increased damage per point of fury you have, but you lose 2 fury per second. You can basically ignore the 2 fury per second. Every time we crit with this build, we get 3 fury back, and with this build, we have a 100% crit chance, or technically we have 99% crit chance, but we are basically capping crit chance on this build perfectly, and so we're constantly over regenning the fury that we would be losing from this, and this is going to give us a giant damage multiplier. Now, I'm currently sitting at 205 fury at 0.3 per fury. I am getting a 61% multiplicative damage increase by wearing this sword for my Whirlwind, which is crazy because I'm getting a 61% damage increase from holding a one-handed sword versus my two-handed damage multiplier only goes up to 60%. And you have to be using this weapon with Whirlwind, aka like if I have this weapon equipped, I can't use a Bludgeon Whirlwind. I don't benefit from it. It has to be skills using this weapon. So with a one-handed Whirlwind, we are getting bleed damage with our slashing, we are getting the multiplicative damage increase from using maces, and we are getting this giant multiplier from using Ramalani's, which is going to give us a 60% additional or multiplicative damage increase with our Whirlwind. For the rest of the gear on your helmet, you're going to want to look for cooldown reduction, maximum life, maximum fury, and second stat if you can get like strength is great, dex is great. I've got damage while berserking, which is also really nice, and the aspect I'm using is basic skills grant me 20% damage reduction for 2 seconds. I'm using a codex aspect, so this could roll up to 6 seconds after I use a basic skill, which would be really, really nice. But you'll notice on my gear and my aspects and my focus and my Paragon tree, I've done a pretty big shift away from as much damage as possible to grabbing a ton of survivability. That is what has led me to be able to do 15 tiers higher in Nightmare Dungeons than I was able to comfortably do on the Dualzerker build, and we're still dealing more damage than that build, which is really, really crazy. And I'll talk about why we're using a basic skill later. Next up, we're using Rage of Haragoth. This is one of my favorite chess pieces. It's not great for damage reduction. You could get a quad damage reduction chess piece, which would be really nice. However, having 100% uptime on our shouts is a massive quality of life. And when you get into a pack of elites and you're spinning with this on, you're using your shouts every like 3 seconds, which feels really, really great. I wish it didn't come with thorns on it. That's a little silly. And you could replace this if you are feeling squishy with a +4 damage reduction chess piece, but I don't think you need to because of how much damage reduction we're getting elsewhere. We'll talk about that soon. Next up, we are using the Edge Master's gloves. I moved my Edge Master's aspect away from my amulet. You guys will probably be happy to see that I'm using Disobedience on my amulet. I don't have a max roll. I actually put my max roll on another amulet, and then I found this one, which was better. But we are no longer using Gore's Gauntlets. I've found one thing that's been pretty unfortunate is that a lot of the Barbarian uniques are not as good as God-rolled legendaries. And this is what I would consider a pretty God-rolled legendary. And the big thing here is we're getting Whirlwind to 99% crit chance. We don't have quite 100. We're at 99%. And part of the reason we're be able to do that is because we have crit chance on our gloves. We've got lucky hit chance, which is massive. Those are the most important things. The crit chance against injured enemies doesn't really matter too much, but crit, Whirlwind, and lucky hit is really nice to have. And by not using Gores, we open up another damage slot where we put the Edge Masters, which allows us to put the Disobedience on our amulet, which gives us more damage reduction. Next up, I'm no longer using the Temera Trees. Temera Trees were nice, but we're no longer using the barrier damage multiplier because we just don't have space for it. And these give us so much more survivability. These are triple roll damage reduction pants. I do have Ranks of Warcry on this. I'm trying to roll them off to armor would be really, really great. However, I'm just out of like reroll currency and stuff like that. But triple roll damage reduction while fortified, damage reduction from bleeding, damage reduction from close will spike your survivability a massive amount. And we're also using the each point of fury generated while at maximum fury grants increased fortify. I do need to upgrade this aspect so I could get more fortify. You guys commented that on my last video. I haven't done that yet. Apologize. But this is going to give us even more fortify. We are relying on fortify to be a base layer of damage reduction, and this helps us build up so much fortify. Next up, we are no longer using the aspect that was giving us our whirlwind to pull enemies. I believe it was called Grasping Whirlwind. That in higher Nightmare Dungeons was just getting me killed. You'd pull a bunch of elites to yourself and you would die. This build is focused on pushing higher nightmares, and we do not want that. So we're grabbing the movement speed. The other option to use here, which you could use that I have been toying around with, is you have a chance when you bleed an enemy to stun them, which works really well with the stun damage that the Mace inherently gets. But for quality of life, movement is really good. You could use both. But yeah, we're focused on movement speed and fury cost reduction. I've also got even more fortified generation on my boots. Next up for our Mace and our weapons. Now, one thing I'm trying to move away from on my weapons, I don't have it on everything, is moving away from the close damage multiplier. Now, close damage is really good. It rolls really high. However, with Whirlwind Snapshotting, it's not as good as it seems. And what I mean by that is, so let's say an enemy is over here, right? If an enemy is over here and I'm over here and I start my Whirlwind over here and I move towards them, this is a weird demonstration, but if I move towards them with Whirlwind and I don't let Whirlwind go, I do not get my close damage multiplier because Whirlwind snapshots your location. I have to recast Whirlwind close to the enemy to get the close damage. So ideally, the perfect God-rolled weapon for this build from now on is vulnerable damage, crit damage, core damage, strength. That is the best that you can possibly do, and I do have that on some weapons. And then we're also using on our two-handed the Whirlwind critical strike chance. Now, it is possible that with this build, how I was speccing Dualzerker, that we would go over 100% crit chance, which wouldn't do anything for us. This is in Warframe. We don't get red crits. However, by almost getting to 100% crit chance, we're able to remove points from things that were giving us critical strike chance and save points for this build. So one of the things that I did was I moved these points from No Mercy into Cut the Bone. Our bleeding effects still increase damage to vulnerable enemies. This is multiplicative damage. My bleeds are currently hitting for around 400,000 damage per second with our bleeds. And this spiked up our bleed damage a ton. And we get to do that because we do not need any more crit chance, because we've got this on our two-handed weapon, which is really, really great. Next up, Ramalani's talked about this. Super good. We've got the Berserk Ripping for even more bleed damage. Stack up those bleeds. Really, really good against single target, strength, core, vulnerable, crit. This is a god roll. Next up on my sword, core, vulnerable, crit, strength. Exactly what we're looking for with the Limitless Rage aspect. Then for our rings, now, on your rings, the most important things to look out for are crit damage, crit chance, vulnerable, and then the last slot is up to you. So the best things to find are Max Fury, Lucky Hit, Max Health, and Resource Generation. I've got Max Fury on both of my rings. These rings are kind of mirrors of each other just because these are my Hoda rings, and one of the cool things about this build is it functions damage-wise very similar to Hoda, so I can just keep on my shout rings. And then lastly, on my amulet, we have the Disobedience. It's going to stack up a ton of armor, even more if I had a max roll here. The biggest things here are the Ranks of Wallop. You're looking for Ranks of Wallop and cooldown are the two most important things for this build. And then Ranks of Defensive Skills is really great. And then Fury Cost Reduction is really great. If this slow duration reduction was Fury Cost Reduction, this would be a perfect God rolled amulet. Now let's go over the skill tree. And to start us off, we're using Lunging Strike. Lunging Strike is going to give us, when we lunging to an enemy, it's going to give us that flat 20% damage reduction, which works really well, not only against groups, but in one-on-ones, when you get in a one-on-one with an elite, which is really, really nice. I just realized that I do not have enough money to refund any more skills. So this is our skill tree. But Lunging Strike, we're going to talk about more when we get to the Paragon board. Next up, we get to Whirlwind with Furious Whirlwind. Now, Furious Whirlwind is kind of a must pick on this because we are using the Haragoth. We do not have an option to not use it. If you're not using the Haragoth chess piece, you can use Violent Whirlwind, but because we're going for a bleed version, this is kind of a must-have. Next up, we've got 3 points into Pressure Point. These 3 points into Pressure Point are really important because you run into so many issues with this build if you do not kill an enemy during your vulnerable window. And this is really our only way to make enemies vulnerable if they live past the vulnerable window. And once you're pushing Nightmare 70 plus and you run into elites, it is very possible for that to happen. So this plus our lucky hit chance that we now get from our gloves, because we're now using normal legendary gloves, we get increased lucky hit chance, and you can get even more lucky hit chance on your rings. It gives us a increased chance to make enemies vulnerable, which is going to skyrocket your damage. The damage difference that you're doing to vulnerable enemies versus non-vulnerable enemies is like insanely noticeable. Next up, we come down to Warcry, and we did make a change here. Now, I originally was giving I took these points in Prolific Fury out because we don't need the Fury generation anymore, and I put them into the 3 damage reduction while berserking. This stacks up to 9% damage reduction, which is really good. I like that choice a lot. However, this is 12% of enemies dealing less damage for 5 seconds whenever we shout them, and technically this is berserking for 4 seconds. We do have some things that are extending berserking, but this is enemies dealing less damage, and we already have a lot of damage reduction, and this is them dealing less damage. It's different than damage reduction, so I think this is more worth than putting aggressive resistance for this damage reduction while berserking, so that is why we're now using that. Next up, we're coming over to Pit Fighter. We do not need No Mercy. We are at 100% crit chance with this build, which we'll talk about more once we get to the Paragon board, but we're going to get increased damage to close enemies and distant damage reduction. Then we're putting 1 point into Hamstring just for the slow, and then we're going to Cut the Bone. Your bleeding effects deal increased damage to vulnerable enemies. This is multiplicative damage. A few of you called me out in Dualzerker for not using this. I don't know why I wasn't using it. That is just strictly on me. Next up, we've got Thick Skin, mainly just to get down to counteroffensive. This is in our 12% increased damage when we have Fortify for more than 50% of our maximum life, which is basically all the time. And then we come down to here. We've got 1 point into Tempered Fury to go down to Invigorating Fury. This is going to heal us for more life, but with the more Fury we spend. I originally had more points into this. The like plus, what was it? The plus 6 Fury is only like 1.8% increased damage with our sword, so not really worth. What is worth here is putting these 2 points that I had into concussion, which we can use skills using bludgeoning weapon. Our whirlwind is technically using a bludgeon and a slashing weapon. This works for both, and our skills using bludgeoning weapons have a 20% chance to stun enemies. And when we stun enemies with our little whirlwind, with our like hybrid whirlwind, I don't even know what to call this, hybrid whirlwind, we're gonna, with our mace expertise, we're gonna get increased damage to stunned enemies, and we have a chance to, when we're hitting stunned enemies, to give ourselves berserking, which is just more quality of life for the build. And then lastly, unbridled rage, no brainer here, just more damage that we get to deal with our whirlwind. Now, I know some of you might not believe or kind of have a doubt that we're able to use 3 expertises with this build: the one-handed sword, and the axe. Currently, our only chance of stunning enemies, our only way to stun enemies, is with whirlwind. So I just want to quickly show you how that we can stun enemies with our whirlwind, which would prove that we are getting the getting all the benefits and all these expertise here. So let's see if we can stun an enemy. Not a great chance of doing it, but we do hit a lot. This is a 70 nightmare dungeon. Just here, just casually doing it. And there is our stunned enemy there. There's another stunned enemy. Just kind of proving that our whirlwind does count as a bludgeon skill, aka we are getting wallop. And we are able to take advantage of the Furious Whirlwind with the slashing, and we're getting the best of both worlds with this build. Next up, we've got my Paragon board, which, by the way, you can find at dpscheck.gg. That is the website that I'm running with my friends, and the Paragon board on the websites are live updated. So if I make any changes or any tweaks, they are live updated there versus this is a static video. And I am flying on a plane this weekend, and I'm trying to spend some time with my Paragon board to see if I can make it better. I'm sure there's some improvements that I can make here and there, but what I am using is really good, so I want to show you guys what I'm rocking. So we've got the exploit glyph in the first board. No brainer there. Exploit's going to give us the guaranteed vulnerable, more vulnerable damage. Then we've got the disembowel glyph. I put the disembowel glyph in this first board, aka the weapons master board, because we don't care too much about the physical damage over time. That's not why we're here with this glyph. It's nice because we are a bleed build, but we're really here just getting the bare minimum to get the bleed cooldown, which is so nice to have. Next up, we've got the territorial glyph. This is going to give us the damage reduction against close enemies and the damage to close enemies. Now, we did say that Whirlwind is a little bit awkward with damage to close because of the snapshot, and I do plan to get away from this glyph. However, it's level 20, and I do not have something that's higher level. The snapshot isn't really an issue with this build because we have to basic attack pretty regularly to keep up our damage reduction, and our basic attack launches us at enemies, and when we're next to an enemy, we get the close damage snapshot, so that is fine. Then we're moving up in the board. I'm not going over literally everything just because you can find it on the website, to what is brand new, which is the Mortal Draw glyph. Now, if you were brought this to my attention, it is fantastic. It's going to give us damage with skills that swap to new weapons. 127% increased damage with skills that swap to new weapons, and swapping weapons has an 18% chance to cause the skill's damage to critically strike. Now, this snapshots, so if I swap to Whirlwind and then I hold Whirlwind, my Whirlwind just gets 18% more critical strike chance, which is fantastic and is what is leading us to our crit strike chance cap, or basically being at 100% or as close to it as we possibly can get. So what is really important with this is that we're using non-dual wielded weapons for our lunging strike. It doesn't really matter, to be honest, if you're using a bludgeoning weapon or using a slashing, but you can go with the bludgeoning weapon. I've got the bludgeoning because we can stun with it. So we dash with the lunging strike and the bludgeoning weapon, and then we swap weapons to our whirlwind, which is going to give us that 127% increased damage and that crit chance. And then when we stack that with our crit chance on our two-handed, plus all the crit chance that I'm getting from there, and the crit chance from the skill, we're at around 100%, which is pretty gross. And we've got even more crit chance on our gloves, which we didn't have before. Next up, we're in the hemorrhage board, which is all about bleed damage, and we're going to be putting the wrath glyph. This is going to give us increased critical strike damage with core skills and critical strikes with our core skills generate 3 fury. Once again, we're basically at crit chance cap, which is constantly generating us fury, which is part of the reason we don't have fury issues on this build. And Wrath is a crit damage multiplier versus everything else is kind of additive. Like the Imbiber is additive, the damage while fortified is additive, even the Mortal Draw is all like additive in those different categories. So this is one of the true like multiplicative glyphs. It's really great to have. And then we're kind of dipping from this board. We don't need this like enemies that have been affected by your bleeding for 3 or more seconds take 12% increased damage from you, because hopefully we're killing enemies faster than them living for 3 seconds, and this is pretty long hike to get up over there. I did think about it, but I just don't think it's worth. And then lastly, we come over to our last glyph, which is going to be the Martial Glyph. Now, I moved the Martial Glyph all the way over from one of our first boards to back here. The reason I did that is because the Martial is going to give us a 100% bonus to all magic nodes within range at my current level up. I've currently only got the Martial to level 16, so this could be much more. But in this board, which is the Flawless Technique board, we've got the crit damage with one-handed weapons. And if we move the Martial Glyph to this, we can boost up all of these crit damage nodes with one-handed weapons, which we are using a one-handed Whirlwind. So we're able to do that. And then we've also got damage reduction from close and more damage reduction from close and more damage reduction from close. And that is my Paragon board. Guys, that is going to do it for the video. I hope you enjoyed. This is a pretty weird niche version of Whirlwind, but I think it's really, really good. We're able to get the best of the Bleed Whirlwind and the best of the Bludgeon Whirlwind and combine it with the Ramalani's Magnum Opus to give us absurd damage. There's really no going back for me personally. So I hope you guys check out this build. Obviously, it does kind of require this unique. So if you do not have this unique, I'd still recommend using the Dualzerker build. That's still a fantastic build, but I do think that this just kind of one-ups it. Guys, that is going to do it for the video. I hope you enjoyed. I will catch y'all in the next one. Take care, guys. Peace.